Brigadier General Maya Washington stared at the blood dripping from her wrists where the two tight handcuffs cut into her skin. The white officer smirked, pressing his knee harder against her back. Resisting arrest, he drawled, unaware his body camera was still recording everything. Before we dive into this shocking story of injustice and redemption, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe if you believe everyone deserves equal treatment under the law, regardless of their skin color. Now let's discover how a decorated military leader found herself brutalized by those sworn to protect and serve. Brigadier General Maya Washington guided her sleek navy blue sedan along the winding roads of rural Georgia, tall southern pines casting dappled shadows across her windshield as afternoon sunlight filtered through. After 23 years of distinguished military service that had taken her across 6 continents and through 3 major conflicts, this rare weekend leave felt both foreign and welcome. The purpose of her journey to Pinewood, Georgia, population 8,743 according to the faded welcome sign she'd passed 10 minutes ago, was a joyous one. Her nephew Darius was graduating with honors from Pinewood High School, the first in their family line to attend college, having secured a full scholarship to Howard University. Maya adjusted her casual civilian clothes, dark jeans and a simple burgundy blouse, feeling somewhat naked without the familiar weight of her uniform and the 4 stars that had become as much a part of her identity as her name. At 43, Maya carried herself with the unmistakable bearing of someone accustomed to command. Her spine remained ramrod straight even in the driver's seat, her dark eyes constantly scanning and assessing, habits formed during tense negotiations in Kabul and strategic planning sessions at the Pentagon. Her military record spoke for itself: 2 Bronze Stars, leadership of the successful extraction of American hostages in Niger that saved 37 lives, and most recently, oversight of humanitarian aid logistics that kept millions from starvation in war-torn regions. The promotion to Brigadier General had come earlier than expected for a black woman from modest beginnings in South Carolina, a fact not lost on Maya or the old guard who still raised eyebrows at her rapid ascension through the ranks. As she pulled into the local gas station, Pinewood Fuel and Market according to the sun-bleached sign, Maya noted the subtle shift in atmosphere that she'd grown accustomed to throughout her life and career. The small group of white men lounging near the entrance fell silent as she stepped from her car, their eyes following her movements with thinly veiled suspicion. Inside, the cashier's smile tightened almost imperceptibly as she approached to pay for her gas. "Just passing through?" the young white woman asked, voice dripping with the suggestion that Maya didn't belong. "Visiting family," Maya replied evenly, years of diplomatic missions having taught her when engagement served no purpose. As she waited for her receipt, Maya couldn't help overhearing a conversation between 2 men in worn overalls by the coffee station. "Sheriff's been doing good work keeping our town clean," one muttered. "Yes, sir, reminds folks where they belong," the other replied with a knowing nod that sent a familiar chill down Maya's spine. As she turned to leave, an elderly black attendant mopping the floor caught her eye. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "you might want to be careful while you're in Pinewood. Some roads aren't safe for our kind after dark." Maya thanked him with a nod, but internally dismissed the warning. She'd navigated tribal conflicts in Yemen and faced down warlords in Somalia. Surely a small town in Georgia posed no significant threat to someone of her position and experience. She'd faced racial incidents throughout her career. The lieutenant who'd claimed her West Point acceptance was just affirmative action. The colonel who'd consistently assigned her the most dangerous missions while promoting less qualified white officers. The countless times she'd been mistaken for administrative staff rather than the commanding officer. Each time, Maya had responded with excellence rather than outrage, letting her performance speak where words would fall on deaf ears. As she pulled back onto the main road, Maya reflected on Pinewood's history, which she'd researched before her visit. Founded in 1857, the town had resisted integration well into the 1970s, and local leadership remained predominantly white despite a population that was nearly 40% black and Latino. Recent years had seen tensions rise after several controversial police incidents involving minorities. though none had garnered national attention. Lost in these thoughts, Maya almost missed the police cruiser that had pulled out behind her, maintaining a consistent distance for several minutes. When the flash of blue and red lights finally illuminated her rearview mirror, Maya felt a momentary flash of irritation rather than concern. She'd been driving exactly 3 miles under the speed limit, her registration was current, and the rental car was in perfect condition. Nevertheless, she signaled and pulled to the shoulder, hands positioned at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel as the cruiser came to a stop behind her. Maya watched calmly in her side mirror as a heavy-set white man in his 50s emerged from the police cruiser, adjusting his belt with practiced authority before approaching her vehicle. The name badge on his tan uniform identified him as Sheriff Donovan Harris, his weathered face set in what appeared to be a permanent scowl beneath the brim of his department-issued hat. The deliberate way his right hand rested on his holstered sidearm sent a clear message that Maya, having dealt with hostile forces across the globe, recognized immediately as an intimidation tactic. "License and registration," Sheriff Harris demanded without preamble, his drawl thick with contempt rather than the customary greeting or explanation for the stop. "May I ask why I'm being pulled over, Sheriff?" Maya inquired politely, maintaining perfect military composure while keeping her hands visible on the steering wheel. The sheriff's jaw tightened visibly. "You were swerving all over the road, ma'am." "Been drinking today?" The accusation was so absurd that Maya momentarily wondered if he'd somehow confused her vehicle with another. Her driving had been impeccable, a habit formed through defensive driving courses required for high-ranking officers operating in hostile territories. "No, sir. I don't drink. I'm an active-duty military officer," she stated clearly, watching his expression for any sign of recognition or respect that might normally accompany such information. Instead, Sheriff Harris's eyes narrowed with obvious skepticism. "Military, huh? Well, ma'am, military or not, I need to see some identification now." The emphasis he placed on "ma'am" carried unmistakable mockery. As Maya reached slowly for her purse on the passenger seat, a second patrol car pulled up, and a younger officer, Deputy Carson Reynolds according to his badge, approached with unwarranted urgency, hand already resting on his weapon. "Everything all right, Sheriff?" he asked, eyeing Maya with immediate suspicion. "Just having a conversation with our visitor here who claims she's military," Harris replied with a sneer. "Step out of the vehicle, ma'am. Standard procedure for a field sobriety check." Maya recognized the escalation for what it was. There was nothing standard about demanding she exit her vehicle for a routine traffic stop with no evidence of impairment. "Sheriff, I've not been drinking or swerving. I'm Brigadier General Maya Washington, United States Army. My identification is in my purse." "I'd be happy to," I said. "Exit the vehicle now." Harris interrupted, his hand moving from his weapon to the door handle. Deputy Reynolds immediately positioned himself on the passenger side, creating a tactical formation that Maya recognized from her combat training. They were treating her as a high-risk suspect. With the practiced calm that had served her through firefights and hostage negotiations, Maya complied, opening her door slowly and stepping out with deliberate movements. "My military identification is in my bag," she repeated, gesturing toward the passenger seat where her purse lay open, her military ID card clearly visible among its contents. Sheriff Harris ignored her statement completely. "Hands against the vehicle, legs spread," he ordered. Maya complied while maintaining her dignity, years of command authority evident in her posture despite the humiliating position. "Sheriff, there's clearly been a misunderstanding. If you just check my identification, I smell marijuana in the vehicle," Deputy Reynolds suddenly announced, though Maya had never used drugs in her life. The fabricated claim provided the pretext they needed to search her car without consent or warrant. As Reynolds began rummaging through her belongings, Sheriff Harris stood uncomfortably close, his breath hot against her neck. "We don't much care for outsiders coming into our town causing trouble," he muttered, too low for any potential witnesses to hear. Maya's military bearing began to crack under the weight of such blatant discrimination. "I'm here for my nephew's graduation," she explained, fighting to keep her voice even. "I'm a Brigadier General with top security clearance. This stop is unwarranted and your conduct is unprofessional." Her words only seemed to anger the sheriff further. By now, several passers-by had slowed their vehicles, and a small group of people had gathered at the edge of a nearby parking lot, some with phones raised. Maya noticed a young black woman boldly recording the encounter from across the street, her expression a mixture of outrage and resolve. "Look at that, Carson!" Sheriff Harris called to his deputy. "Seems like the general here brought an audience." When Deputy Reynolds emerged from searching her car, he held her military ID card between two fingers as if it were contaminated. "Says here she's some big shot in the army," he announced with obvious disbelief. "Probably fake," Sheriff Harris replied without even glancing at the identification. "Lots of those going around these days." Maya felt a surge of indignation rise within her chest. "You can verify my identity with the Department of Defense. My commanding officer is General James Harrington at the Pentagon. I insist you contact him immediately." The mention of the Pentagon seemed to trigger something in Sheriff Harris. His expression hardened, and he exchanged a loaded glance with Deputy Reynolds. "You're being detained for suspected DUI, possession of narcotics, and now for impersonating a military officer," he declared loudly enough for the gathering crowd to hear. "I'm going to need you to place your hands behind your back." Maya stood her ground, years of command experience giving her the confidence to challenge this obvious abuse of power. "Sheriff, this is completely unwarranted. I demand to speak with your superior officer immediately." Those words, particularly "demand," coming from a black woman, visibly pushed Sheriff Harris past his breaking point. "That's resisting arrest," he shouted, lunging forward with unexpected speed for a man of his size. Before Maya could process what was happening, Sheriff Harris grabbed her arm and violently spun her around, slamming her against the side of her own vehicle with such force that the impact knocked the breath from her lungs and sent a sharp pain radiating through her shoulder. The cold metal of her car pressed against her cheek as Deputy Reynolds joined in, roughly grabbing her other arm and wrenching it backward at an unnatural angle that sent white-hot bolts of pain shooting through her rotator cuff. 2 decades of specialized combat training had taught Maya Washington precisely how to break free from such holds. A simple shift of weight, a targeted strike to pressure points, and both men would be temporarily incapacitated. But in that crucial moment, Maya made the calculated decision that would ultimately change everything. She chose restraint. Any defensive maneuver, no matter how justified, would be twisted into assaulting an officer, and potentially end with bullets rather than handcuffs. "Stop resisting!" Sheriff Harris shouted for the benefit of witnesses, though Maya's body remained completely compliant despite the unnecessary force being applied. The handcuffs came next, metal bracelets ratcheted so tightly around her wrists that they immediately began cutting into her skin, constricting blood flow and sending pins and needles sensations through her fingers. "These are too tight," Maya stated calmly, her military training in withstanding interrogation techniques now serving her in this unexpected scenario. "I'm not resisting arrest, but you're causing injury." Her reasonable request was met with a knee pressed hard against her lower back, forcing her further against the vehicle as Sheriff Harris leaned close to her ear. "Should have stayed wherever you came from," he whispered, his voice too low for the gathering crowd or any recording devices to capture. "Your kind don't belong in Pinewood." Maya's military ID card had fallen to the ground during the scuffle, the gold emblem of her rank catching sunlight as it lay face up on the asphalt, but Sheriff Harris deliberately stepped over it, leaving it untouched as if it were invisible. The crowd of witnesses had grown considerably, their reactions split between horrified silence and vocal outrage. "She wasn't doing anything wrong!" shouted an elderly white woman clutching her purse in both hands. "This is how they treat us every day," countered a middle-aged black man, shaking his head with resigned familiarity. Maya focused on the young black woman who had been filming since the beginning, making brief but meaningful eye contact, a silent acknowledgement that this documentation might be her only hope for justice. Despite the increasing pressure against her back and the burning pain in her wrists, Maya maintained her composure by silently reciting the military code of conduct that had guided her through 23 years of service. I am an American, fighting in the forces which guard my country and our way of life. I am prepared to give my life in their defense. The familiar words centered her amid chaos, a meditative practice that had served her through firefights and ambushes far more dangerous than this small-town injustice. Deputy Reynolds began searching through her vehicle with renewed vigor, tossing her carefully packed overnight bag onto the ground and rifling through its contents with deliberate disrespect. When he discovered her dress uniform, complete with Brigadier General insignia and rows of combat medals, he held it up with a sneer. Playing soldier with Halloween costumes now? He called out loudly enough for the onlookers to hear. Carson, check if her body camera's on, Sheriff Harris muttered, momentarily forgetting that his own recording device was still active. Already switched mine off, Deputy Reynolds replied, unaware that this admission was being captured by both the sheriff's equipment and numerous civilian phones. Once Maya was secured in the back of the police cruiser, blood now visibly dripping from where the handcuffs had broken skin, she watched through the window as Sheriff Harris instructed a third officer who had arrived on scene to impound her vehicle. Another completely unwarranted action that would further complicate her ability to attend her nephew's graduation ceremony now just 18 hours away. Through the partially opened window, Maya could hear Sheriff Harris speaking to Deputy Reynolds. Teach these people they can't just come into our town throwing around fake military IDs and expecting special treatment. The casual prejudice in his tone made it clear that these people had nothing to do with military imposters and everything to do with the color of Maya's skin. As the cruiser pulled away, Maya caught a final glimpse of her military identification still lying on the ground where it had fallen, about to be crushed beneath the tire of a departing police vehicle. Do you think Maya should have defended herself against this injustice, or was her restraint the right decision? Comment number 1 if you believe she should have stood her ground more forcefully, or number 2 if her strategic patience will ultimately serve justice better. Hit that like button if you've ever witnessed or experienced similar abuses of power, and subscribe to see how deep this corruption goes in Pinewood. What do you think will happen once Maya reaches the police station? Will anyone believe her identity, or is this just the beginning of her ordeal? The Pinewood Police Station was a squat brick building that had clearly seen better days, with flickering fluorescent lights casting a sickly pallor over institutional green walls as Sheriff Harris roughly guided Maya through a side entrance to avoid the growing crowd of curious onlookers gathering at the front. The booking officer, a heavy-set woman with graying hair pulled into a tight bun, looked up from her computer with obvious disinterest until her eyes fell on Maya's bloodied wrists, momentarily widening before professionalism masked her reaction. Name? She asked flatly, fingers poised over her keyboard while steadfastly avoiding eye contact. Brigadier General Maya Washington, United States Army. Maya replied with quiet dignity, her military bearing impossible to diminish despite the handcuffs and humiliation. The booking officer's fingers froze midair as she finally looked directly at Maya, then at Sheriff Harris with unmistakable confusion. Did you say General? She asked, already typing the name into the system. Before Maya could respond, Sheriff Harris stepped between them, physically blocking the booking officer's view of her computer screen. She's claiming to be military to avoid charges. Book her as Maya Washington, civilian, charges to include resisting arrest, assaulting an officer, possession of falsified federal identification, and driving under the influence. The booking officer frowned, turning her monitor slightly to reveal what had appeared on her screen, a full military service record complete with photograph, rank confirmation, security clearance level, and current posting at the Pentagon. Sheriff, the system shows she's actually, computer error. Sheriff Harris interrupted sharply. Happens all the time with these federal databases. Process her on my authority. The booking officer hesitated, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to challenge the sheriff's direct order. Her fingers moved reluctantly across the keyboard as she completed the intake process, pointedly avoiding Maya's gaze. I'm entitled to my phone call, Maya stated calmly when the fingerprinting was complete, her right to contact counsel or command being one of the few leverages she currently possessed. "Phones are down," Sheriff Harris replied with transparent insincerity. "Technical difficulties. You can call someone when they're back up." Without further explanation, Maya was led down a narrow corridor to a holding cell already occupied by 4 other detainees, 3 black men and 1 Latina woman, all of whom regarded her with varying degrees of surprise as she was roughly pushed inside, the cell door clanging shut with ominous finality. "Welcome to Pinewood Justice," muttered one of the men, a middle-aged individual in work clothes who introduced himself as Marcus. "What did they get you for? Driving while black?" There was no humor in his tone, only resigned familiarity with a system he clearly knew all too well. As Maya carefully took a seat on the metal bench, mindful of her injured wrists and shoulder, she briefly explained her situation, watching as expressions of outrage and sympathy spread across her cellmates' faces. "They did the same thing to my brother last month," offered the Latina woman who identified herself as Elena. "Claimed he was drunk when he never touched alcohol in his life. $3,000 in fines and lost his job because he couldn't make bail." As the conversation continued, a disturbing pattern emerged through the shared experiences of her fellow detainees: minorities targeted without cause, excessive force as standard procedure, trumped-up charges leading to pleas rather than trials, and Judge Roland Maxwell, a name mentioned with particular dread, who consistently handed down maximum sentences to defendants of color, while offering probation or dismissals to white offenders charged with identical crimes. "Wait a minute," interrupted the youngest of the men, leaning forward with sudden recognition. "Did you say General Washington? Weren't you the one who coordinated that rescue operation in Niger a few years back? My cousin was one of those soldiers you brought home." Maya nodded, somewhat surprised to be recognized in these circumstances. 37 servicemen and women extracted without casualties," she confirmed. "Your cousin served with honor." The young man's eyes widened. "You're actually her? For real? And these racist cops just threw you in here without even checking?" His voice had risen enough to carry beyond the cell, causing a young officer passing in the hallway to slow his pace, glancing curiously through the bars before continuing on his way with troubled expression. As morning stretched into afternoon, Maya observed the station operations through the limited vantage point of her cell, noting numerous procedural violations that would never be tolerated in a military facility: evidence bags left unsealed, booking forms signed without being read, and most troublingly, what appeared to be Sheriff Harris and Deputy Reynolds huddled over a computer terminal, reviewing what Maya suspected was body camera footage they were editing or deleting. The young officer who had shown interest earlier returned, ostensibly to check on the holding cell occupants, but clearly focused on Maya. "Can I get you some water, ma'am?" he asked quietly, his nameplate identifying him as Officer Taylor. "What I need is my phone call and medical attention," Maya replied, raising her still bleeding wrists. "These cuffs were applied with excessive force and have caused injury." Officer Taylor's eyes lingered on her wounds, and something like shame flickered across his features. "I'll see what I can do," he murmured before walking away, his shoulders tense beneath his uniform. Hours passed without the promised call or medical attention, during which Maya learned from her cellmates that they had all been held well beyond the legal limit without formal charges. A clear violation of their constitutional rights, but apparently standard practice in Pinewood. Through careful observation and strategic questions, Maya pieced together a disturbing picture of systematic corruption extending from the police department to the courthouse, with minorities bearing the brunt of a justice system warped by prejudice and personal profit. When Officer Taylor returned a third time, he approached the cell under the pretense of delivering water but slipped something into Maya's hand as he passed the cup through the bars, a small cell phone, screen already unlocked. 5 minutes, he whispered. "Security cameras are on a loop for maintenance." Without hesitation, Maya dialed her military aide, Captain Sofia Rodriguez, speaking rapidly in hushed tones. "This is Brigadier General Washington. I've been unlawfully detained in Pinewood, Georgia. Notify General Harrington and legal immediately. Situation involves civil rights violations and..." Her communication was abruptly terminated when Sheriff Harris appeared at the cell door, face contorted with rage as he unlocked it and lunged toward Maya, ripping the phone from her grasp with such force that she was nearly pulled from the bench. "Contraband!" he bellowed, turning his fury toward Officer Taylor, who stood frozen in the corridor. "Who authorized this? Who gave her a phone?" Officer Taylor opened his mouth to respond but was interrupted by Deputy Reynolds' arrival. "Judge Maxwell is ready for her first thing tomorrow morning," Reynolds announced with obvious satisfaction, "holding her overnight for the full package of charges." Sheriff Harris's anger transformed into smug satisfaction as he pocketed the confiscated phone. "Hope you're comfortable, General," he sneered, making air quotes around her rank. "You've got about 16 hours to think about all the laws you broke in our town." As they walked away, Maya clearly heard Deputy Reynolds muttering about teaching her a lesson she won't forget, and Sheriff Harris's chilling response, "Maxwell owes me a favor. She'll be lucky to see daylight for a month." In that moment, Maya understood that she was facing not just individual prejudice but an entrenched system designed to punish those who didn't know their place in Pinewood's racial hierarchy, a system that hadn't anticipated capturing someone with her resources and connections in its web. The brief phone call might not have been enough to communicate all details, but Captain Rodriguez was highly competent and would recognize the seriousness of the situation from the mere fact that her commanding officer had been detained. As night fell over the small police station, Maya closed her eyes not in defeat but in tactical assessment, mentally preparing for the courtroom confrontation that awaited her in the morning while remaining unaware that events had already been set in motion far beyond Pinewood's city limits. While Maya endured her night in Pinewood's holding cell, a very different storm was brewing in the digital realm, beginning with a simple social media post from Kiana Johnson, the young black woman who had documented Maya's arrest from across the street. Happening now: black woman brutally arrested in Pinewood for driving while black. Police ignored military ID and used excessive force. Share before they take this down. Hashtag Pinewood Injustice, hashtag Black Lives Matter, read the caption accompanying the 3-minute video that showed the entire confrontation in devastating clarity. Within the first hour, the post had accumulated 50,000 views. By midnight, that number had exploded to over 2 million, with users across every platform sharing, commenting, and expressing outrage at the obvious abuse of power captured in high definition. The video's reach expanded exponentially when Master Sergeant Thomas Wilson, stationed at Fort Benning, recognized Maya immediately despite her civilian clothes. "That's Brigadier General Washington," he commented in all caps, sharing the video to several military community pages. "She saved my entire unit in Niger. Someone contact the Pentagon now." His identification sparked an avalanche of verification as other service members confirmed her identity, sharing photos of General Washington from military ceremonies, news coverage of her humanitarian efforts, and official Department of Defense press releases about her historic promotion. Civilian news organizations initially approached the story with caution, but as military confirmation of Maya's identity mounted, producers began scrambling for coverage angles. "4-star general handcuffed in small-town America," screamed one headline, incorrectly elevating her rank in the rush to publish. "Decorated war hero detained. Racial profiling in Georgia," declared another. By 3 a.m., CNN had dispatched a field crew to Pinewood, with MSNBC, Fox News, and every major network following suit, their satellite trucks creating an impromptu media encampment around the town square. Pentagon officials were awakened in the pre-dawn hours as the story penetrated military command channels, creating an unprecedented crisis involving one of their highest-ranking officers. Brigadier General James Harrington, Maya's direct superior and longtime mentor, initiated emergency protocols usually reserved for hostage situations or international incidents involving military personnel. "I want every available resource directed to Pinewood, Georgia," he ordered during a hastily assembled video conference with the Judge Advocate General's office. Full background checks on everyone involved in her detention, particularly this Sheriff Harris and Judge Maxwell. I want to know if they've ever gotten so much as a parking ticket." Meanwhile, digital investigators were already uncovering troubling patterns through public records searches. Sheriff Donovan Harris had accumulated 27 civilian complaints for excessive force over his 15-year career, with 23 involving minorities, all dismissed without investigation by the Pinewood Police Department's Internal Affairs Division, which consisted solely of Harris himself and a civilian clerk. Deputy Carson Reynolds had transferred to Pinewood after being quietly dismissed from 2 previous departments for conduct unbecoming. The details conveniently sealed by departmental agreements. Most damning was the statistical analysis of Judge Roland Maxwell's sentencing record. Black defendants in his courtroom received sentences averaging 3.4 times longer than white defendants charged with identical crimes, a disparity that exceeded national averages by a factor of 2. As dawn broke over Pinewood, local officials found themselves thrust into an unwanted spotlight, with the mayor's office phone ringing continuously and email servers crashing under the volume of incoming messages demanding justice for General Washington. Mayor Frank Sullivan, who had initially planned to support his police department unequivocally, found himself paralyzed between conflicting pressures as national attention focused on his previously obscure town of 8,000 residents. "Just stand by the sheriff," advised his longtime political ally Councilman Robert Jenkins during an emergency breakfast meeting at the mayor's home. "This'll blow over once people move on to the next outrage." City Attorney Patricia Moore shook her head vehemently in disagreement. "This isn't going away, Frank. We're talking about a highly decorated military officer with direct Pentagon connections. There's already talk of a federal civil rights investigation. We need to get ahead of this." While local officials debated damage control strategies, the military community mobilized with characteristic efficiency. Veterans groups from neighboring counties organized a peaceful protest outside the Pinewood Police Station, many arriving in full dress uniform adorned with combat medals, forming a silent line of over 100 former service members standing at parade rest in disciplined rows. Their presence drew even more media attention, with aerial shots from news helicopters showing the small police station surrounded by a growing crowd of supporters interspersed with camera crews and reporters broadcasting live updates to a national audience now fully invested in the unfolding drama. At the Pentagon, Secretary of Defense Victoria Chin was briefed on the situation during her 6 a.m. security update, her usual stoic expression giving way to visible anger as she reviewed the viral footage and Maya's service record simultaneously. "I want our best JAG officers in Pinewood within the hour," she ordered, reaching for her secure phone. "And get me everything we have on this judge. I'll be making a personal call before his court session begins." Few people in the Pentagon knew that Secretary Chin and Maya Washington shared a personal connection beyond their professional relationship. They had served together during early combat operations in Afghanistan, where then Captain Washington had led a daring rescue mission that extracted then Major Chen's unit from an ambush that would have otherwise been fatal. The Secretary's debt to Maya Washington was both professional and deeply personal, a fact she had never publicly acknowledged but which now fueled her determination to ensure justice was served. In Pinewood, Sheriff Harris remained obstinately unmoved by the growing crisis, refusing to take calls from state officials and instructing his department to maintain a media blackout. "We don't answer to the court of public opinion," he told his deputies during a tense morning briefing. "We enforce the law as we see fit, and some Pentagon bureaucrats aren't going to tell us how to run our town." His bravado masked growing concern as he noticed several deputies requesting sudden sick days and observed Officer Taylor's conspicuous absence from the morning roll call. Most troubling was the mayor's text message, the first direct communication from Sullivan in months, reading simply, "Meeting in my office, 10 a.m. Non-negotiable." Back in her holding cell, Maya Washington remained unaware of the national firestorm her arrest had ignited, having been deliberately isolated from any news or outside contact on Sheriff Harris's direct orders. The blood on her wrist cuffs had dried to a dark crimson, her shoulder throbbed from being wrenched during the arrest, and 20 hours without food had left her physically depleted. Yet her military bearing remained undiminished as deputies arrived to transport her to the courthouse. Time to face the judge, announced Deputy Reynolds with poorly concealed satisfaction. Hope you enjoy orange jumpsuits, General. You'll be wearing one for quite a while. Maya said nothing, conserving her energy for the legal battle ahead while remaining unaware that forces far beyond Pinewood's municipal boundaries were converging to ensure that justice, long absent from Judge Maxwell's courtroom, would finally have its day. The Pinewood County Courthouse stood as an anachronistic monument to faded Southern grandeur, its columned facade and aging brick exterior speaking to an era when justice was explicitly designed to serve only a portion of the citizenry, a historical irony not lost on Maya as she was led up the worn marble steps in handcuffs that continued to bite into her swollen wrists. Sheriff Harris gripped her arm with unnecessary force, parading his captive past the assembled crowd with the triumphant bearing of a hunter displaying a prize trophy, seemingly oblivious to the gathering storm evidenced by the unprecedented media presence and the growing number of military uniforms visible among the spectators. "Keep walking," he muttered when Maya paused momentarily at the sight of veterans standing at attention as she passed, many rendering solemn salutes despite her civilian attire and restrained condition. The courthouse interior maintained the same faded elegance as its exterior, with high ceilings, dark wood paneling, and portraits of stern-faced judges, all white men, lining the main corridor leading to Courtroom 3 where Judge Roland Maxwell had presided for nearly 2 decades. Maya took careful note of her surroundings with the tactical awareness that had served her through 3 combat zones, identifying potential exits, observing security personnel positions, and most importantly, recognizing the subtle indicators of a system designed to intimidate rather than serve. From the Confederate memorial prominently displayed in the main hall to the conspicuous absence of any diversity among courthouse staff. The courtroom itself was unexpectedly crowded for what would normally be routine arraignments, with every bench filled and additional spectators standing along the back wall, many holding phones despite posted prohibitions against recording devices. Maya recognized the social powder keg represented by this divided audience, one section populated primarily by white residents wearing expressions of defensive hostility, another dominated by Black and Latino community members watching with guarded expectation, and scattered throughout, individuals in military attire whose disciplined posture contrasted sharply with the tension permeating the room. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Roland Maxwell," announced the bailiff as a side door opened to admit a thin, white-haired man whose wire-rimmed glasses and carefully pressed black robes created a scholarly appearance at odds with his reputation for harsh, discriminatory sentencing. Judge Maxwell surveyed the unusually crowded courtroom with visible displeasure, his gaze lingering momentarily on the media representatives before settling on Maya with an expression of predetermined judgment that confirmed everything her cellmates had warned about Pinewood's justice system. "Be seated," he ordered tersely, shuffling through papers while studiously ignoring the unusual circumstances surrounding this particular docket. "First case, State vs. Washington. Charges include resisting arrest, assaulting an officer, presenting false federal identification, and driving under the influence." Sheriff Harris stepped forward eagerly, prepared to present his fabricated testimony with the confidence of someone accustomed to having his word accepted without question in this particular forum. "Your Honor, yesterday afternoon at approximately 1400 hours, I observed the defendant driving erratically on Main Street, swerving between lanes in a manner consistent with intoxication," Harris began, embellishing his false narrative with practiced authority. "Upon initiating a traffic stop, the defendant became immediately combative, refusing to comply with basic commands and eventually physically resisting arrest, requiring myself and Deputy Reynolds to employ necessary restraint techniques." Judge Maxwell nodded with performative thoughtfulness, occasionally glancing at Maya with thinly veiled contempt as Sheriff Harris continued his fabricated account, describing a confrontation that bore no resemblance to the events captured on multiple videos now circulating nationwide. When Harris finished his testimony, Judge Maxwell adjusted his glasses and addressed Maya directly for the first time. "Does the defendant have representation?" he asked, the question clearly rhetorical as no public defender or private attorney stood beside her. "I have requested counsel since my unlawful detention, Your Honor, but have been consistently denied my constitutional rights. Maya responded with the calm authority that had commanded military operations across 3 continents. I am Brigadier General Maya Washington, United States Army, currently assigned to the Pentagon's Joint Chiefs Operational Command. My detention is not only unlawful but potentially compromises national security protocols requiring my presence at scheduled briefings. A murmur spread through the courtroom at her clear, unwavering declaration, but Judge Maxwell merely removed his glasses with theatrical weariness. Ms. Washington, this court has little patience for individuals who attempt to evade responsibility by claiming military status or other special circumstances. Sheriff Harris has testified to your intoxication, resistance, and presentation of falsified military identification. Unless you have an attorney present to enter a formal plea, I am inclined to. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with dramatic timing, interrupting Judge Maxwell mid-sentence as all heads turned to witness the entrance of an imposing group in crisp military dress uniforms, led by Lieutenant Colonel James Harrison of the Judge Advocate General Corps, his chest adorned with combat ribbons and his bearing projecting absolute authority, as he strode confidently down the center aisle, followed by 4 additional JAG officers and a civilian in an expensive suit who was immediately recognizable to many as Thomas Bennett, the renowned civil rights attorney whose cases had reached the Supreme Court on multiple occasions. Your Honor, Lieutenant Colonel Harrison announced without waiting for acknowledgement. I am Lieutenant Colonel James Harrison, representing Brigadier General Maya Washington by direct order of the Secretary of Defense. I have documentation confirming General Washington's identity, rank, and the unlawful nature of her detention, which we are prepared to present to this court immediately. Judge Maxwell's face flushed with anger at this unprecedented interruption of his courtroom authority. This is highly irregular. You cannot simply barge into ongoing proceedings regardless of your military status. Court officers, please remove these individuals until proper, Your Honor. Harrison continued, unperturbed by the judge's protestations. I am also authorized to inform you that the Department of Justice has opened a formal investigation into civil rights violations within the Pinewood Police Department and municipal court system, with specific focus on the systematic pattern of discrimination evidenced in arrest records and sentencing disparities under your jurisdiction. Additionally, the Governor has been notified of potential grounds for judicial review of your conduct in this and related cases. The courtroom erupted in shocked conversations as Judge Maxwell banged his gavel repeatedly, his composed judicial demeanor crumbling under this direct challenge to his authority. This is outrageous. Bailiff, restore order immediately. We will have a 15-minute recess while I consult with my clerk regarding these allegations. As Maxwell retreated hastily through his chamber door, Sheriff Harris attempted to approach him, but was physically blocked by court security, now uncertain where true authority resided in the rapidly shifting power dynamics. During the recess, Lieutenant Colonel Harrison moved quickly to Maya's side, producing a key for her handcuffs while the military medical officer accompanying him began examining her injured wrists. Secretary Chen sends her personal regards, General. Harrison informed her quietly. Your aide received your call and initiated emergency protocols. We have satellite footage of your entire drive through Pinewood confirming no traffic violations occurred, and the body camera footage Sheriff Harris attempted to delete has been recovered by Pentagon's cybersecurity. The situation is under control. For the first time since her ordeal began, Maya allowed herself a moment of relief, though her expression remained professionally neutral as she observed Sheriff Harris engaged in an increasingly heated discussion with Deputy Reynolds, both men casting frequent glances toward the chamber door where Judge Maxwell remained sequestered with his clerk. The recess extended well beyond the announced 15 minutes, stretching to nearly 45 before Judge Maxwell reemerged, his earlier confidence replaced by visible apprehension as he resumed the bench with forced composure. In light of new information provided to this court, he began without meeting anyone's gaze directly. I am temporarily suspending proceedings in this matter pending verification of the defendant's identity and status. Before he could continue, the courtroom doors opened once again, this time admitting a young aide who hurried to Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, whispering urgently in his ear before handing him a secure phone. Harrison listened briefly before approaching the bench with renewed purpose. "Your Honor, I have Secretary of Defense Victoria Chen on a secure line. She has requested to address this court directly regarding General Washington's detention. Do you think Judge Maxwell should be held personally accountable for his pattern of discriminatory sentencing, or is the system itself more to blame than any individual?" Comment number 1: If you believe individuals must face consequences for upholding corrupt systems, or number 2: if you think addressing the broader structural issues should take priority. Hit that like button if you're inspired by Maya's dignity under pressure, and subscribe to see how the Secretary of Defense's unexpected intervention will transform this small-town injustice into a national reckoning. What do you think will happen when one of the highest military authorities in the country confronts a local judge who's used to operating without oversight? Judge Maxwell stared at the secure phone in Lieutenant Colonel Harrison's outstretched hand as if it might detonate, the unprecedented notion of answering directly to the Secretary of Defense visibly destabilizing his judicial composure, while the packed courtroom held its collective breath in anticipation of this extraordinary collision between small-town authority and federal power. After several seconds of tense hesitation, Maxwell reluctantly accepted the device, his hand trembling slightly as he raised it to his ear. "This is Judge Roland Maxwell," he stated, attempting to maintain a veneer of judicial authority despite the unusual circumstances. Whatever Secretary Chen said in response drained the remaining color from the judge's face, his eyes widening as he listened without interruption to what was clearly an unambiguous communication delivered with the full weight of Pentagon authority. The one-sided conversation lasted less than 2 minutes, but its impact was immediately evident as Maxwell returned the phone to Harrison with noticeably less steady hands than when he had accepted it. "This court will take a 30-minute recess," he announced, voice strained as he avoided making eye contact with anyone in the room, particularly Sheriff Harris, whose increasingly agitated attempts to approach the bench were being physically blocked by court security officers who seemed to sense the dramatic shift in power dynamics occurring before their eyes. As Judge Maxwell retreated to his chambers for the second time that morning, Maya was finally permitted to speak with her military legal team, the handcuffs removed at last to reveal deep lacerations around both wrists that the military physician began treating immediately. "Secretary Chen sends her personal regards," Lieutenant Colonel Harrison informed her quietly while the courtroom buzzed with speculation. She reminded Judge Maxwell of federal jurisdiction in cases involving military personnel and the potential consequences of interfering with a commanding officer's duties during a time of ongoing international operations. Maya nodded, maintaining her professional composure despite the relief washing through her. "The Secretary and I served together in Afghanistan," she explained to Harrison. "She never forgets her people." Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion at the courthouse entrance as additional military personnel arrived, not JAG officers this time, but a full Pentagon legal team in civilian attire, accompanied by 6 FBI agents whose presence signaled an escalation beyond military advocacy to potential criminal investigation. Simultaneously, local news crews broadcasting live from outside the courthouse reported the unexpected landing of military helicopters at the town's small municipal airport, and the equally surprising arrival of 2 National Guard transport vehicles whose purpose remained unspecified but whose timing could hardly be coincidental. Sheriff Harris, observing these developments from the courtroom's side entrance, attempted to exit discreetly only to find his path blocked by 2 FBI agents who had positioned themselves at all courthouse exits. "Just stepping out for a smoke," he offered with forced casualness, receiving only silent, professional stares in response as he reluctantly returned to the increasingly uncomfortable position at the prosecution table. When Judge Maxwell finally re-emerged from his chambers after 45 minutes, well beyond his stated 30-minute recess, his transformation was immediately apparent to everyone present. Gone was the arrogant judicial confidence that had characterized his decades on the bench, replaced by the cautious demeanor of someone suddenly aware they were navigating a legal minefield. "In light of information provided to this court regarding Brigadier General Washington's status and the federal jurisdiction applicable in this case," he began without preamble, All charges are hereby dismissed with prejudice. General Washington is to be released immediately with the court's sincere objection." Sheriff Harris interrupted, rising from his seat with unexpected vehemence. "Your Honor, dismissing these charges without even hearing the full evidence is a miscarriage of justice and completely inconsistent with standard procedures in your courtroom." The judge's face hardened at this public challenge to his authority. "Sheriff Harris, you are out of order. Approach the bench immediately." As Harris complied with visible reluctance, their hushed conversation became increasingly animated, with the sheriff gesturing emphatically while the judge repeatedly shook his head, their long-time alliance visibly fracturing under the extraordinary pressure of federal scrutiny. When Harris finally returned to his seat, his expression had transformed from indignation to dawning apprehension as the reality of his situation began to penetrate his previously impenetrable confidence. "As I was saying," Judge Maxwell continued with forced composure, "all charges against Brigadier General Washington are dismissed with prejudice. Furthermore, this court wishes to extend its apologies for any inconvenience or discomfort experienced during this unfortunate misunderstanding." The calculated understatement of inconvenience to describe Maya's treatment drew audible reactions from the gallery, but before protests could formalize, the courthouse doors opened once again to admit FBI Special Agent Tanya Rodriguez, whose purposeful stride down the center aisle commanded immediate attention. "Your Honor," she announced without requesting permission to address the court, "I am Special Agent Rodriguez with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Civil Rights Division. I am here to inform the court that pursuant to an ongoing federal investigation, we are executing search warrants for the Pinewood Police Department records, municipal court documents, and personal communications of several local officials related to potential civil rights violations under federal statutes 18 U.S.C. Section 242 and 18 U.S.C. Section 14141. The systematic dismantling of Pinewood's judicial autonomy continued as Agent Rodriguez placed a thick folder of documents on the judge's bench. "These warrants have been approved by a federal judge and require immediate compliance. Additionally, we have been authorized to secure all body camera footage, dashboard recordings, and electronic communications from the Pinewood Police Department for the past 60 months as part of our investigation." Sheriff Harris abruptly stood, his face flushing dark red as the implications became clear. "This is federal overreach. You can't just come into our jurisdiction and, actually, Sheriff," Agent Rodriguez interrupted calmly, "that's precisely what we can and are doing. Your department's pattern of conduct has triggered a formal pattern or practice investigation under the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act. I suggest you cooperate fully, as obstruction will only compound the potential charges being considered." As if to emphasize the seriousness of the federal presence, additional FBI agents entered the courtroom, positioning themselves strategically throughout the space while technical specialists began setting up equipment to secure digital evidence from courthouse computers. Maya, now receiving proper medical attention for her injured wrists, observed the systematic dismantling of Pinewood's corrupt power structure with the analytical detachment of a military strategist, recognizing that her personal ordeal had become the catalyst for a long-overdue intervention in a system that had operated without meaningful oversight for generations. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison approached with updated information, speaking quietly so only Maya could hear. "The Secretary has authorized me to inform you that this situation has accelerated a planned federal investigation that was already in preliminary stages. Your incident was the tipping point that provided probable cause for immediate action rather than continued monitoring." Maya nodded thoughtfully, connecting this new information with the patterns described by her cellmates. "How extensive is the investigation?" she asked, watching as Sheriff Harris was now being formally served with additional documents by federal agents, his previous bravado replaced by growing alarm. "Comprehensive," Harrison replied with professional satisfaction. "Financial records going back 7 years, sentencing patterns, arrest demographics, property seizures, and funding allocations. Initial data analysis flagged Pinewood months ago for statistical anomalies suggesting systematic civil rights violations, but building a federal case required triggering incidents exactly like yours. The courtroom dynamics had completely reversed from the morning's beginning, with Judge Maxwell now answering questions rather than asking them, Sheriff Harris isolated at the prosecution table as deputies strategically distanced themselves from their formerly untouchable leader, and Maya, now officially released from custody, receiving respectful acknowledgments from courthouse personnel who hours earlier had processed her detention with callous indifference. The most visible symbol of this power transformation came when a court officer who had previously treated Maya with contempt approached with awkward deference, extending her personal belongings in a plastic evidence bag. "Your identification and personal effects, General," he stated formally, unable to meet her gaze directly. "And your vehicle has been released from impound. The department will cover all associated costs." Maya accepted her belongings with dignified acknowledgement, neither gloating over the reversal nor displaying the anger she would have been fully justified in expressing. As she prepared to leave the courthouse surrounded by her military escort, Sheriff Harris made one final attempt to approach her, only to be intercepted by FBI agents who firmly redirected him toward Agent Rodriguez for what would undoubtedly be the first of many uncomfortable interviews about his department's practices. Outside the courthouse steps, the gathered crowd, now swelled to several hundred, erupted in cheers and applause as Maya emerged, the local community members who had experienced similar injustices particularly vocal in their support. Military veterans rendered salutes which Maya returned with perfect form despite her injured wrists, the simple gesture communicating volumes about duty and respect that transcended the immediate circumstances. As media crews surged forward seeking statements, Lieutenant Colonel Harrison stepped in to manage the situation with practiced efficiency. Brigadier General Washington will be transported to receive proper medical attention for injuries sustained during her unlawful detention, he announced to the assembled press. The Department of Defense and Department of Justice will issue formal statements regarding ongoing investigations into civil rights violations in Pinewood. No further questions at this time. With that conclusive statement, Maya was escorted to a waiting military vehicle, her ordeal in Pinewood apparently concluded but her impact on the town only beginning to unfold as federal investigators swarmed through municipal buildings, securing evidence of corruption that had festered unchallenged for decades until one woman of extraordinary courage and position had experienced firsthand what countless ordinary citizens had endured without recourse or remedy. What had begun as a routine arraignment in a small-town courthouse had transformed into an unprecedented federal intervention by early afternoon, the Pinewood County Judicial Chamber now functioning as an impromptu command center for FBI Special Agent Tanya Rodriguez's Civil Rights Investigation Team. With computer specialists accessing court records while forensic accountants reviewed municipal financial documents, and interview teams processed a growing line of local residents eager to share their experiences with a justice system that had systematically failed them for generations. Agent Rodriguez, a 20-year veteran of high-profile civil rights cases, stood at the center of this controlled chaos, directing operations with calm efficiency until a uniformed court officer approached with obvious reluctance. "Agent Rodriguez, Judge Maxwell is requesting a brief recess before continuing with today's proceedings," the officer stated, glancing nervously toward the judge's chambers where Maxwell had retreated shortly after the FBI's arrival. "He says he's feeling unwell and needs to consult with his personal attorney." Rodriguez checked her watch with deliberate slowness before responding. "Inform Judge Maxwell that while I sympathize with his sudden concern for proper legal representation, a courtesy he has frequently denied defendants in his courtroom according to our preliminary review, federal warrants do not operate on his preferred schedule. He may contact his attorney from this courtroom while we continue securing evidence. If he leaves the building, he will be considered non-cooperative with a federal investigation." The officer departed with this unambiguous message, leaving Rodriguez to turn her attention to the main courtroom doors which opened to admit a team of technical specialists wheeling in equipment cases. Facial recognition is complete on all courthouse security footage from the past 36 months. The lead technician reported, setting up a portable display screen. "We've identified 743 defendants processed through this courtroom, with demographic analysis showing 92% of maximum sentences were imposed on minority defendants, while 78% of case dismissals benefited white defendants," creating a statistical disparity that exceeds random distribution by a factor of 11. As this damning data visualization appeared on screen, the courtroom fell silent, the stark numerical evidence confirming what local minority residents had experienced as painful reality for decades. The technical team continued setting up equipment, while Rodriguez consulted briefly with Maya, who had returned to the courthouse after receiving medical treatment for her injuries. General Washington, we believe your case has accelerated the timeline of an investigation that was originally scheduled for implementation next quarter, Rodriguez explained quietly. Your military status and the viral documentation of your treatment created the perfect probable cause for immediate intervention rather than continued monitoring. In essence, they picked the absolute worst person to target with their standard operating procedure. Maya nodded thoughtfully, her military analyst's mind already processing the strategic implications. How extensive was the pre-existing investigation? She inquired. Quite thorough, Rodriguez replied with professional satisfaction. Pinewood triggered multiple statistical red flags in our civil rights violation detection algorithms. Excessive force complaints, sentencing disparities, property seizure patterns, and demographic arrest anomalies. We've been building a case file for approximately 16 months, but lack the triggering incident necessary for probable cause to execute warrants. Your unlawful detention provided exactly what we needed. Their conversation was interrupted as Sheriff Harris was escorted back into the courtroom by 2 FBI agents, his previously commanding presence diminished by the removal of his service weapon and the confiscation of his department badge and credentials. Judge Maxwell emerged from chambers simultaneously, accompanied by a nervous-looking man in an expensive suit who was presumably the personal attorney he had summoned. The symbolic power shift was complete. The 2 men who had controlled Pinewood's justice system with impunity now stood as subjects of investigation rather than arbiters of others' fates. Agent Rodriguez moved to the center of the courtroom, activating the main display screen with a silent command to her technical team. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to be transparent about why we're here today, she began, addressing not only the court officials but the local residents and media representatives who had been permitted to remain as witnesses to this unprecedented intervention. What began as an algorithmic anomaly in our civil rights monitoring system 16 months ago has developed into one of the most comprehensive investigations of systematic judicial corruption my division has undertaken in the past decade. The screen behind her illuminated with a map of Pinewood County overlaid with color-coded data points representing arrests, property seizures, and sentencing outcomes, the pattern of discrimination visible even to untrained observers as the visualization highlighted the stark racial disparities in every category of law enforcement and judicial action. For the past 7 years, the Pinewood Police Department under Sheriff Harris's leadership has demonstrated arrest rates for minority citizens that exceed statistical norms by 400% when controlled for population demographics. Rodriguez continued, the display changing to show comparative charts. Similarly, Judge Maxwell's sentencing patterns show minority defendants receiving sentences averaging 3.4 times longer than white defendants for identical charges with similar criminal histories. Sheriff Harris attempted to interrupt, rising from his seat with reflexive authority until a firm hand on his shoulder from a nearby FBI agent reminded him of his altered circumstances. This is selective data interpretation, he protested nevertheless. You're not accounting for repeat offenders and aggravating circumstances. Actually, Sheriff Harris, we've controlled for all standard variables. Rodriguez countered smoothly, signaling her technical team to advance to the next display. But since you've raised the issue of repeat offenders, perhaps we should discuss these particular records. The screen shifted to display financial transactions between the Pinewood Police Department's asset forfeiture account and several local businesses, including construction companies, automotive repair shops, and property management firms. Over the past 60 months, approximately $2.7 million in seized assets were channeled through these businesses, with 26% of proceeds ultimately returning to accounts controlled by Sheriff Harris, Judge Maxwell, and 3 members of the County Commission through a sophisticated laundering operation involving shell companies and fictional consulting fees. The courtroom erupted in shocked exclamations as this financial evidence was displayed, particularly from local residents who recognized the businesses named in the investigation. Rodriguez allowed the reaction to continue briefly before raising her hand for silence. "We have extensive documentation, including recorded conversations between Sheriff Harris and Judge Maxwell discussing which defendants to target for maximum asset seizure potential. I believe this excerpt is particularly illuminating." With another signal to her technical team, the courtroom audio system activated, projecting a recorded conversation with crystal clarity. "Got another one of those fancy SUVs coming through town tomorrow," Sheriff Harris's distinctive voice announced. "Driver fits the profile, should be good for at least a distribution charge if we plant enough evidence." Judge Maxwell's response was equally incriminating. "Set the bail high enough that they'll have to forfeit the vehicle. Works every time with these people. They never have enough cash to make bail." The recording continued with explicit references to targeting out-of-town minorities who would have limited resources to fight charges, with specific discussions of how to split proceeds from vehicle auctions and property seizures. Sheriff Harris slumped visibly as his own voice condemned him, while Judge Maxwell stared straight ahead, his attorney frantically scribbling notes beside him. As the recording concluded, Maya studied the reactions throughout the courtroom, noting the expressions of vindication among local minority residents who had experienced this corruption firsthand, contrasted with the shock displayed by white community members who had benefited from, or remained willfully blind to, the systematic injustice operating in plain sight. Agent Rodriguez continued methodically presenting evidence, including body camera footage showing officers planting evidence, dashboard recordings of racially motivated traffic stops, and email exchanges between court officials discussing how to ensure maximum penalties for specific demographic groups. The comprehensive nature of the corruption was staggering, extending beyond the police and courts to include county commissioners who approved budgets supporting these practices, property developers who acquired seized real estate at below-market rates, and even local media outlets that systematically underreported complaints from minority communities. As the presentation continued, Maya found herself experiencing complex emotions. Vindication that her ordeal had triggered this long-overdue intervention, but also sober recognition that her military rank and Pentagon connections had provided her leverage unavailable to countless others who had suffered similar or worse treatment without recourse. This realization crystallized her resolve to ensure that whatever reforms emerged from this investigation would protect all citizens, not just those with institutional power or social connections. The most stunning revelation came when Agent Rodriguez displayed evidence that Maya's random traffic stop had actually been carefully orchestrated after Sheriff Harris learned of her arrival in town. "We've recovered text messages between Sheriff Harris and local gas station owner Victor Simmons, who alerted the department when General Washington stopped for fuel," Rodriguez explained, displaying the incriminating messages on screen. Sheriff Harris specifically instructed his deputies to find a pretext to stop her vehicle, with the stated intention to teach her kind a lesson about coming to our town. This premeditated targeting elevates the civil rights violations to an entirely different category of federal offense. This final piece of evidence transformed the atmosphere in the courtroom completely, eliminating any remaining doubt about the intentional nature of the discrimination that had infected Pinewood's justice system. Even Judge Maxwell's attorney appeared to recognize the indefensible nature of the evidence, leaning toward his client to whisper what appeared to be advice about cooperation rather than continued denial. As Agent Rodriguez concluded her presentation, she turned directly to Maya with unexpected formality. "Brigadier General Washington, on behalf of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Department of Justice, I want to formally acknowledge that your willingness to endure this injustice with dignity and restraint has created an opportunity for systemic reform that will benefit countless citizens beyond Pinewood. While we deeply regret the treatment you experienced, your personal sacrifice has accelerated a federal intervention that might otherwise have taken months or years to implement." Maya acknowledged this statement with the composed dignity that characterized her military bearing, neither seeking credit nor minimizing the significance of the moment. "Justice delayed is justice denied," she responded simply. My position afforded me protections that many citizens lack. The real test of this intervention will be ensuring that every person receives equal protection under the law, regardless of rank, race, or resources. As the formal proceedings concluded, an unexpected figure approached Maya, Officer Taylor, the young policeman who had slipped her the phone during her detention, now visibly nervous but determined as he addressed both Maya and Agent Rodriguez. "I have additional evidence," he stated quietly, producing a flash drive from his pocket. "I've been documenting departmental violations for the past 18 months. Illegal searches, evidence tampering, targeting instructions based on race. I just never knew who to trust with it until now." Rodriguez accepted the drive with professional appreciation, recognizing the courage required for this act of whistleblowing. "Your cooperation will be noted in our investigation, Officer Taylor. The Department of Justice values those who uphold their oath to the Constitution even when doing so requires standing against corrupt leadership." As Taylor departed with FBI agents to provide formal testimony, Maya reflected on the extraordinary chain of events her simple journey to attend a nephew's graduation had triggered, a journey that had unexpectedly exposed decades of injustice and potentially created a pathway to reform that would impact generations to come. The true revelation was not merely the corruption that had been uncovered, but the recognition that systemic change often required someone with the proper position and power to experience injustice personally before institutional forces would mobilize to address long-standing patterns of abuse that had been normalized through repetition and rationalization. 6 months after her harrowing ordeal in Pinewood, Brigadier General Maya Washington's government vehicle crossed the town limits once again, though the community she entered bore little resemblance to the one that had treated her with such injustice half a year earlier. The faded "Welcome to Pinewood" sign had been replaced with a new marker declaring, "Pinewood, a community committed to equal justice." Beneath the standard population figure, a small but significant indication of the transformation that had swept through this formerly segregated town in the wake of the federal investigation her unlawful detention had triggered. Maya drove directly to the town square where a ceremonial ribbon-cutting was scheduled for the newly established Civil Rights Compliance Office, a federal oversight installation that would monitor local law enforcement and judicial practices for the next decade as part of the consent decree Pinewood had signed to avoid more severe federal penalties. The square itself had been physically transformed, with the controversial Confederate memorial that once dominated the space now replaced by a monument honoring local civil rights pioneers whose names had previously been deliberately erased from community memory. As Maya parked and emerged from her vehicle in full dress uniform, she was immediately recognized by local residents who approached with respect rather than the suspicion that had characterized her first visit. "General Washington, it's an honor to have you back in Pinewood," greeted Mayor Elaine Jackson, the newly elected African-American leader who had replaced disgraced Mayor Sullivan after his indictment for financial improprieties connected to the police department's asset forfeiture program. "Your courage changed everything for our community." Maya accepted the greeting with professional warmth, having maintained contact with Pinewood's reform movement during the intensive 6 months of transition that followed the FBI intervention. Her personal experience had become the catalyst for her current assignment, heading the Pentagon's newly established Military-Civilian Justice Interface Task Force, a specialized unit developing protocols for ensuring equitable treatment of military personnel within civilian justice systems while simultaneously addressing broader patterns of discrimination that affected all citizens regardless of military status. "The real courage came from your community members who lived with these injustices for generations," Maya responded, nodding toward the gathered crowd that included many familiar faces from her night in the holding cell and the subsequent courthouse confrontation. "I simply had the institutional support that magnified their long-standing concerns into action." The ceremony proceeded with speeches from federal officials, newly appointed local leaders, and community organizers who had spent decades documenting the abuses that the FBI investigation had finally validated. Maya listened with professional attention while scanning the crowd, noting the presence of former Sheriff Harris's deputy, Carson Reynolds, being escorted from the square by federal marshals after attempting to disrupt the proceedings, one of the few former officials who had refused to acknowledge wrongdoing even after overwhelming evidence and multiple convictions. Most of Pinewood's former power structure had faced significant consequences. Sheriff Harris and Judge Maxwell were both serving federal prison sentences for civil rights violations and financial crimes. 3 county commissioners had accepted plea agreements in exchange for testimony against higher officials. And numerous business owners who had profited from the corrupt asset seizure program had been forced to make restitution to victims of their schemes. More meaningful than these individual punishments, however, was the systematic restructuring of Pinewood's institutions. A civilian oversight board now reviewed all police actions involving use of force. Body camera footage was automatically uploaded to secure servers beyond local control. Judicial appointments underwent rigorous review for bias. And all asset forfeitures required federal approval with proceeds directed to community development rather than department budgets. After the formal ceremony concluded, Maya made her way to the local high school where her nephew Darius, whose graduation she had missed during her detention, was speaking to students about his first semester at Howard University and his newly declared intention to attend military academy afterward, inspired by his aunt's courage in confronting systemic injustice. Seeing Aunt Maya stand her ground against corruption showed me that real change requires people willing to serve something larger than themselves, he told the assembled students, his pride evident as he acknowledged Maya's presence in the audience. Whether that's in uniform or in your community, the principle is the same. Justice doesn't happen automatically, it needs defenders. Following the school event, Maya visited the gas station where her Pinewood journey had begun, now under new management after former owner Victor Simmons had lost his business license for his role in targeting minorities for police harassment. The elderly attendant who had warned her during her first visit, John Freeman, she now knew, greeted her with a warm handshake. "Never thought I'd live to see this day, General," he confessed, gesturing toward the community transformation visible even from the gas station windows. 57 years I've lived in Pinewood, documenting every injustice I witnessed in journals nobody wanted to read. Now those same journals are evidence in federal court and teaching material for police training." Maya had learned that Freeman, far from being just a gas station employee, had been a methodical chronicler of Pinewood's discriminatory practices for decades, his detailed records providing historical context for the patterns identified in the FBI's data analysis. His seemingly small act of warning her during her first visit represented just one moment in a lifetime committed to justice against overwhelming odds. The culmination of Maya's return visit came that evening at a community reconciliation forum held in the same courthouse where she had faced Judge Maxwell's bias proceedings. The renovated space now featured a permanent exhibition documenting Pinewood's history of discrimination alongside the ongoing efforts to create genuine equity. An unflinching acknowledgement that reform required honest confrontation with past failures rather than comfortable erasure. As Maya prepared to address the gathered community members, a side door opened to admit an unexpected visitor, Secretary of Defense Victoria Chin, whose personal intervention had helped turn the tide during Maya's ordeal. "I hope you don't mind me crashing your event, General," Secretary Chin announced as surprised murmurs spread through the audience. "The Pentagon's commitment to this initiative goes beyond memoranda and funding. We're personally invested in its success." After acknowledging the Secretary's presence with appropriate protocol, Maya delivered her prepared remarks about the Washington protocols being implemented nationwide, standardized procedures for civilian law enforcement interactions with military personnel that simultaneously protected service members' rights while preventing preferential treatment that might create 2 tiers of justice. "The true measure of these reforms," Maya emphasized, "isn't how they protect people with rank and institutional support, but how they elevate standards for everyone. Equal justice requires universal application, not special carve-outs for those with power or position." Following the formal presentation, Secretary Chin requested a private moment with Maya, guiding her to a quiet corner of the courthouse while community discussions continued in the main chamber. "There's something I never told you about why I responded so personally to your situation," Chin confided once they were alone. 28 years ago, before my Pentagon career, I experienced almost identical treatment in a small Midwestern town, pulled over without cause, disbelieved about my military status, subjected to humiliating treatment. The difference was that I had no smartphone video, no viral outrage, no Pentagon position that commanded immediate response. It took 3 days before my commanding officer even located me. Maya listened with newfound understanding of the Secretary's extraordinary commitment to her case. "You never mentioned this during the intervention or afterward," she observed. "Some experiences are more valuable as motivation than as stories." Chen replied simply. "Watching you transform personal injustice into systemic reform confirmed I made the right decision in recommending you for the task force. This was never just about one incident or one town. It's about fundamentally recalibrating the relationship between authority and accountability across every jurisdiction." As their conversation concluded and they rejoined the community forum, Maya reflected on the complex alchemy that transformed individual suffering into collective progress, how her momentary degradation in handcuffs had catalyzed changes that would protect countless others who would never know her name or story. The young officer who had slipped her the phone during her detention, Taylor, was now leading Pinewood's reformed police department with a commitment to constitutional policing that had earned cautious community support. Former detainees who had shared her holding cell were now serving on civilian oversight committees, their lived experience of injustice informing policies designed to prevent its recurrence. Even some former opponents of reform had become unlikely allies after confronting irrefutable evidence of the system's failures, their transformed perspectives demonstrating that accountability could lead to redemption rather than merely punishment. As Maya prepared to depart Pinewood the following morning, she paused at the town limits for a final moment of reflection, studying her reflection in her car window, the 4 stars on her uniform shoulders representing not just military authority but the responsibility that came with power and position. The true transformation hadn't been just in Pinewood's institutions or leadership, but in Maya's own understanding of her role in a broader struggle for justice that extended far beyond military boundaries or personal vindication. The handcuff marks on her wrists had faded to faint scars, but their impact would continue through policies and practices that recognized a fundamental truth: justice is measured not by how a system treats the powerful, but by whether it protects the vulnerable with equal vigor and unfailing commitment. Have you ever witnessed a moment when someone's personal suffering became the catalyst for wider positive change? Share your thoughts in the comments about how individual courage can transform broken systems. If you believe that every injustice exposed brings us one step closer to a more equitable society, please hit that like button, subscribe to hear more stories of transformation, and share this with someone who needs a reminder that one person's stand against corruption can create waves of change that reach far beyond what they could have imagined. Thank you for joining me on this journey through darkness into hope, and remember, true justice isn't just about punishing wrongdoing. It's about creating systems where dignity and equality aren't exceptional, but expected. This story illustrates how systemic discrimination persists in America's justice system until confronted by irrefutable evidence and institutional power. Maya's experience reveals that equality under law remains aspirational rather than universal in many communities. Her ordeal demonstrates that corrupt systems rely on isolation and intimidation, targeting those they assume lack resources or connections to fight back. When they mistakenly targeted someone with institutional backing, their entire corrupt ecosystem collapsed. The transformation shows that genuine reform requires more than removing bad actors, it demands restructuring systems that enabled abuse. True justice isn't achieved through individual punishments alone, but through transparent accountability mechanisms and community oversight that prevent future violations. Maya's restraint in the face of provocation proved more powerful than resistance would have been. By choosing dignity over retaliation, she preserved her moral authority while allowing her oppressors to reveal their true nature through their actions. Perhaps most importantly, this story reminds us that privilege carries responsibility. Maya could have simply used her position to escape personal injustice, but instead leveraged her experience to create protections for everyone, regardless of rank or status. Real leadership transforms personal suffering into collective progress, ensuring that power serves justice rather than undermining it. Have you ever witnessed discrimination that went unchallenged because the victim lacked resources or connections to fight back? Or have you been in a situation where speaking truth to power felt impossible but necessary? Share your experiences in the comments below. This story shows how courage in the face of injustice can create ripple effects far beyond one person or community. If you believe that accountability is essential for a functioning justice system, hit that like button to help this story reach others. Subscribe to hear more powerful narratives about ordinary people and extraordinary courage in the ongoing struggle for equality. And please share this video with someone who might need a reminder that standing up against discrimination, even when difficult, is how lasting change begins. Thank you for joining me on this journey through Maya's transformation from victim to catalyst for reform. Remember that in the fight for justice, your voice matters, your witness matters, and your courage matters.